No one in that glass-walled boardroom expected the CEO's arrogant smirk to vanish. But the moment Lucas Thorne finished mocking his cleaner for quitting, he froze. Because through the entrance, a man in a grey suit was waiting, holding a contract worth more than Thorne's quarterly bonus. Lucas Thorne was the kind of CEO who believed his success was a product of his own ruthless genius. He built a tech empire from nothing, and everyone in that room knew it, including Maria, the quiet cleaner he'd just humiliated for daring to leave. But the man at the door wasn't there for a meeting. He was there for Maria, and the document in his hand was about to expose a truth Thorne had spent years burying. Thorne's empire, Apex Dynamics, was a Silicon Valley fairy tale. He dropped out of Stanford at 20, built a data analytics firm that predicted consumer behavior with chilling accuracy, and took it public in a billion-dollar IPO by 33. His management style was legendary, cutthroat, efficient, and brutally meritocratic. Or so the headlines said. But the real engine of Apex wasn't code, it was fear. He ruled from the 44th floor, a glass penthouse where the cleaners arrived after midnight, invisible. Maria Silva had been one of them for 3 years. A single mother who worked the graveyard shift, she polished his mahogany desk and emptied the trash bins filled with the remnants of his power lunches. To Thorne, she was part of the building's infrastructure, like the HVAC system. Until this morning, when she'd quietly given her 2 weeks' notice. He'd called her into the boardroom in front of his stunned executives. "Let me understand," he'd said, leaning back in his $1,000 chair. "You're leaving to what? Find a better mop?" A ripple of nervous laughter. Maria stood straight, her blue uniform neatly pressed. "Personal reasons, sir," Thorne smirked. "Personal reasons? This company pays you more than you'd make anywhere else. You have health benefits, and you're throwing it away." He'd leaned forward, his voice a weapon. "People like you don't get opportunities like this twice. Walk out that door, and you'll be back to scrubbing toilets in a motel within a month. Remember that." Maria didn't argue, she just met his gaze, a quiet steadiness that unnerved him more than defiance. She left the room, and Thorne turned back to his team, laughing it off as a lesson in loyalty. That was 10 minutes ago. Now the man in the grey suit at the entrance held everyone's attention. He was mid-40s, with the calm posture of someone who never had to raise his voice. In his hand was a black leather folder. Thorne's head of security, a burly man named Roy, stepped toward him, but the visitor simply raised a badge. A federal seal glinted in the morning light. Roy stopped cold. Thorne's mind raced, scanning for threats. A lawsuit, an SEC audit, but the man's eyes weren't on the CEO. They tracked across the room, past the bankers, past the glass walls, and landed on the service door Maria had just exited through. Then he looked back at Thorne and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not of greeting, of acknowledgement. "What is the meaning of this?" Thorne boomed, reclaiming the room. "You're interrupting a private meeting." The man walked forward, his steps silent on the plush carpet. He placed the leather folder on the conference table, right on top of Thorne's financial projections. "My name is Samuel Vance. I'm here as an escrow agent for the Solara Foundation." The name meant nothing to Thorne, but the bankers at the table shifted. One of them, a senior VP from Goldman, paled. Vance opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and clipped to it, a cashier's check. The amount was written in clear, typed figures, $15 million. The payee line read, Maria Silva. The purpose, full and final payment, Project Da Vinci acquisition. Thorne's brain short-circuited. Project Da Vinci was his company's internal code name for their most secret, most valuable asset, a proprietary algorithm that could map and influence human decision-making. It wasn't patented. It wasn't in any prospectus. It existed in fragments, known only to Thorne and his lead engineer. There was no way this janitor, could be connected to it. "This is a joke," Thorne hissed. "Or fraud." Vance didn't blink. "The authenticity of the check is verified. The contract, signed by Maria Silva yesterday, transfers all intellectual property rights she holds for Project Da Vinci to the Solara Foundation. We are here to finalize and disperse." He turned to the head banker. "You can confirm the funds are cleared and present in your institution's holding account. The routing number is on the check." The room erupted. Thorne's lawyers scrambled for their phones. His COO was shouting about breaches of non-disclosure, but Thorne was silent, staring at the check. Maria Silva, the cleaner, the woman he just told would end up in a motel. She sold something for $15 million, something that belonged to him. His memory flashed back to a night 2 years ago. He'd been working late, frantic ahead of a board meeting. He'd printed a stack of schematics, complex flowcharts of the Da Vinci logic tree. In his exhaustion, he'd left them on the printer in the shared alcove. In the morning, they were gone. He'd assumed the cleaning staff had recycled them. He'd berated the facilities manager and installed shredders in every office. Now a chilling realization began to dawn. What if she hadn't shredded them? What if she'd taken them? And more terrifying, what if she understood them? He grabbed his phone and typed a frantic message to his head of security. "Find Maria Silva. Now, do not let her leave the building." Then he looked at Samuel Vance. "This transaction cannot proceed. There is a pending internal investigation into intellectual property theft. I am placing a freeze on any related assets." Vance smiled, a thin, cold line. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Mr. Thorne. The transaction is complete. The IP is no longer yours to claim. It hasn't been for 36 hours. He slid a second document from his folder. It was a copyright and patent registration filed with the USPTO in the name of Maria Silva, dated 18 months earlier. 18 months? She owned it legally for over a year while she'd been emptying his trash. Thorne felt the floor tilt. His company's valuation, its next funding round, his entire legacy was built on stolen sand. And the thief hadn't been a rival in a suit. It was the woman who cleaned his toilet. The humiliation was a physical pain, hot and sharp in his chest. But beneath it, a deeper, more primal fear was waking up. How did she do it? And what else did she know? He never heard the service door open again. He didn't see Maria step back into the room, having changed out of her uniform into simple jeans and a sweater. She walked over to Samuel Vance, who handed her the check. She looked at it, then directly at Lucas Thorne. For the first time, he saw the intelligence in her eyes, sharp and calculating. It was the look of a chess player who had just called checkmate. "You wanted to know my personal reasons for leaving, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice clear and steady in the dead silence. "I'm taking my son out of the country. The medical treatments he needs aren't available here. But before I go, Mr. Vance has one more document for you to see." Samuel Vance produced a final sheet of paper. This one wasn't a contract. It was a subpoena from the United States Department of Justice. The subject line read, "Investigation into data privacy violations and consumer fraud, Apex Dynamics, Inc." Thorne reached for the table to steady himself. Maria Silva hadn't just stolen his algorithm. She had been documenting everything. Every cut corner, every breached firewall, every illegal data scrape. For 3 years. And she hadn't just sold his secret. She had handed the keys to his downfall to the federal government. The room dissolved into chaos. But Maria just turned and walked toward the exit, the $15 million check in her hand. As the glass doors slid closed behind her, Lucas Thorne was left with one burning, terrifying question that would consume him. Who was Maria Silva, really? And what had he been so arrogantly blind to all this time? The story of Maria Silva didn't begin in a corporate penthouse. It began 12 years earlier, in a cramped university lab in Porto Alegre, Brazil. Her name then was Dr. Maria Silva Costa, a prodigy in computational neuroscience, whose doctoral thesis on neural network mapping was so groundbreaking, 3 tech giants tried to recruit her before she'd even defended it. She chose Apex Dynamics, not the American HQ, but their new research wing in Sao Paulo. Lucas Thorne's signature was on her offer letter, a 7-figure salary to lead Project Da Vinci. Her task was to build the theoretical framework for an algorithm that could model human desire. She was 24 years old. For 2 years, she lived in the code. She built the core architecture, the very logic tree Thorne now claimed as his sole genius. Then, during a routine security audit, she discovered something else. Buried within the datasets Apex was using, millions of anonymized medical records purchased from a collapsed hospital chain were glaring irregularities. The data wasn't just anonymized, it was altered. Diagnostic codes were changed. Patient outcomes were fabricated. The algorithm she was building was learning from a lie. She took her concerns to the Sao Paulo lead, who took them to headquarters. The response from Thorne himself was a single line in an email forwarded by her boss. "The data is commercially sourced and validated. Stay in your lane, build the product. Maria requested a formal ethics review. The next day, her security clearance was revoked. She was escorted from the building and presented with a severance agreement so dense with non-disclosure terms it would silence her for life. She refused to sign. What followed was a legal and personal siege. Apex sued her for breach of contract and intellectual property theft, claiming she was trying to steal her own work to sell to a competitor. The lawsuits drained her savings. The legal pressure in Brazil was immense. Then, the final blow, her young son, Leo, was diagnosed with a rare muscular dystrophy. The treatment he needed wasn't available there. She needed to get to the United States, and she needed money fast. Apex's offer was a trap. They would drop the lawsuits, provide a modest settlement, and even sponsor a work visa if she signed the NDA and admitted fault. Desperate, she signed. The visa they provided was not for a scientist. It was a temporary custodial work permit. They made her a cleaner. It was the ultimate humiliation, a way to ensure she was always nearby, always under their thumb, and never believed if she spoke. They placed her in the San Francisco headquarters, where she could see her life's work being weaponized, floor by floor. For 3 years, Maria Silva cleaned, and she watched, and she planned. Every discarded memo, every left on-screen email, every confidential printout forgotten on a copier, she collected them. She couldn't take digital files, but paper was invisible. She saw the real Project Da Vinci come to life, not as a tool for market prediction, but as a psychological profiling weapon sold to political consultancies and hedge funds. She saw the DOJ subpoenas begin to trickle in, and she saw Thorne's lawyers swat them away. Her plan was simple, brutal, and legally airtight. Brazilian copyright law, unlike American law, has strong moral rights provisions for creators. The original schematics from her lab notebooks, mailed to herself years ago, established her authorship. She quietly filed the international patents in her name. She waited. She documented every conversation, every data breach, every fraudulent report she overheard while emptying trash bins. The $15 million from the Solara Foundation, an ethical tech consortium that had been trying to uncover Apex's practices for years, wasn't just payment. It was a trap for Thorne. They knew he'd try to freeze it, to fight it in the open. And the moment he did, he'd be admitting the algorithm existed and that he claimed ownership, which would make the subpoena in Samuel Vance's folder unignorable. Back in the boardroom, the chaos solidified into a cold, clear disaster. The bankers left, citing liability. Thorne's lawyers were in a side room, screaming into their phones. The stock market hadn't opened yet, but the pre-market trading of Apex shares was already tanking on rumor alone. Thorne dismissed everyone and walked to his office. He closed the door and stood at the window, the city sprawling beneath him like a circuit board he no longer controlled. His phone buzzed. It was his head of security, Roy. "We lost her, sir." She exited the service elevator into the garage, got into a car with Vance. "We have the plate, but it's a registered vehicle of the Solara Foundation. Legal says if we pursue, it's kidnapping." "Forget the car," Thorne said, his voice hollow. "I want everything on her, not the employee file. Everything. Go back 10 years. I want to know who she really is." The file landed in his inbox an hour later. It was thin, too thin. The Brazilian records were spotty, sealed by their courts. The US immigration file showed her as a custodial worker, but there was a photograph from a university website archive dated 12 years back, a young woman with sharp, intelligent eyes accepting a doctoral award. The caption read, "Dr. Maria Silva Costa, winner of the Lawrence Prize for Computational Innovation." Thorne felt the air leave his lungs. He knew that name, Costa. He had signed off on her recruitment. He had read the initial reports from Sao Paulo calling her a once-in-a-generation talent. He had also signed off on her termination when she became a liability. The memory was a bureaucratic ghost, buried under years of success. The cleaner he had mocked was the architect, the genius he had fired and then tried to erase. A new, more visceral fear took root. If she was Costa, then she didn't just steal the algorithm, she built it. Her patent was likely real, and her documentation of Apex's crimes wasn't just hearsay from a janitor. It was an eyewitness account from the chief scientist. He called his most ruthless lawyer Diane Croft. "The DOJ subpoena, how bad is it?" Diane's silence was answer enough. "It's a fishing expedition, Lucas, but they're using dynamite. They're asking for every internal communication about data sourcing for Da Vinci going back to the Sao Paulo days. They have specific case numbers from the fabricated medical records. Someone gave them a map. She gave them a map, Thorne whispered. We can fight it delay for months, but if they get a warrant based on what they already have, this goes beyond civil fraud. This is criminal conspiracy to defraud. The SEC is one thing, the Attorney General's office is another. Thorne ended the call. He looked at the pre-market ticker on his screen. Apex was down 18%. The board would be calling within the hour. He had built an empire on the idea of predictable control. Now, the most unpredictable variable of all, a woman he'd considered a non-entity, had pulled a single thread, and the entire tapestry was unraveling. But Lucas Thorne wasn't a man who surrendered. Humiliation curdled into a frigid, focused rage. Maria had money now, she had protection, she had the law on her side, but she also had a son, a sick son who needed treatment. That was a vulnerability. Every piece has a weakness, you just have to find the pressure point. He picked up his phone again and scrolled past his lawyers, past his board members, to a contact saved under a single initial. He pressed call. A voice answered after 2 rings, smooth and accentless. Yes. I have a containment problem, Thorne said. A former employee. She just left the building with significant intellectual property and has triggered a federal action. I need her current location, and I need to understand her immediate plans. The child is the priority. Understood, the voice replied. Standard retainer applies. We'll begin tracing the financial disbursement. The child will give us a vector. As Thorne hung up, he allowed himself a sliver of grim satisfaction. The game had changed, but he was still a player. Maria Silva had won the battle, but she didn't understand the war she'd started. She thought she was escaping to save her son, but in doing so, she had just put a target on the only thing in the world she truly cared about. And Lucas Thorne was an expert at targeting weaknesses. Maria's car didn't go to an airport. Samuel Vance drove them across the Bay Bridge to a nondescript medical complex in Berkeley. This was the Solara Foundation's secure clinical wing, where Leo was immediately evaluated by a specialist flown in from Switzerland. The treatment plan was aggressive and expensive. The $15 million wasn't for a life of luxury. It was for a life, period. For the first time in 3 years, Maria allowed herself to cry silent tears of relief as she held her sleeping son. Vance gave her a phone. It's clean. Your legal team is on speed dial. The Foundation's security detail is outside. Thorne won't get within a mile of this building. But Maria wasn't thinking about Thorne. She was thinking about the treatment protocol. It required 12 months of intensive therapy. They couldn't leave the country for a year. Her escape was now a siege. Meanwhile, Lucas Thorne's private investigator, known only as Kale, was already working. Tracing a $15 million cashier's check was elementary. The bank, obligated to report the transaction's destination for anti-money laundering purposes, logged the receiving account, a trust under the Solara Foundation. Kale dug deeper. He found the trust's linked expenditures. The largest, by far, was a pending transfer to the Basel Institute of Neuroimmunology in Switzerland. The purpose was coded as a long-term therapeutic residency. Thorne received the update in his office, now stripped of its usual hum, a tomb of quiet panic. She's not running, she's getting the boy treatment. Here, in the Bay Area, a cruel smile touched his lips. A stationary target was easier than a moving one. Find the clinic. But Kale's next report carried a warning. The Solara Foundation has formidable resources. Their security is former intelligence. Their legal team preemptively filed restraining orders against you and Apex Dynamics, citing harassment and witness intimidation. They're expecting your move. Attempting direct contact with the subject now would be legally unwise. Thorne slammed his fist on the desk. I'm not paying you for legal advice. Find a pressure point he doesn't control. The line went quiet for a moment. There is another vector, Kale said slowly. The medical visa she used to enter the country 3 years ago. It was sponsored by Apex. Our immigration counsel informs me that if the sponsoring company withdraws its support and reports a violation of terms, the visa is revoked instantly. She would be deemed deportable. Thorne's eyes lit up. It was bureaucratic, brutal, and perfect. Do it. File the revocation. Have it flagged as urgent. I want her status invalidated by tomorrow." He hung up, a fresh surge of adrenaline cutting through the despair. She could have her money and her lawyers, but if her legal right to be in the country vanished, she'd be separated from her son during his treatment. She would have to come to him, begging for a remedy. But Thorne had misjudged the battlefield. While he was plotting immigration maneuvers, the Solara Foundation's legal attack was moving from defense to offense. Using Maria's treasure trove of documents, the discarded memos, the printed emails she'd saved for 3 years, their attorneys constructed a devastating timeline. They didn't just give it to the DOJ. They filed a civil racketeering suit, a RICO case, against Apex Dynamics and Lucas Thorne personally. The lawsuit landed like a bomb. It alleged a criminal enterprise built on stolen intellectual property, fraudulent data, and the deliberate coercion and intimidation of a whistleblower. It quoted Thorne's own "stay in your lane" email. It detailed the fabricated medical records, and for the first time, it publicly named Dr. Maria Silva Costa as the creator of Project Da Vinci and the plaintiff. The news broke at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. By 4:05, Apex's stock was in freefall, triggering automatic trading halts. The board of directors, who had been silent, now erupted. An emergency conference call was convened. Thorne tried to control the narrative, blaming a disgruntled former employee and a rival foundation. But the board had seen the lawsuit filing. They had heard the panic in their own lawyers' voices. The lead independent director, a steely former judge named Elena Shaw, spoke last. "Lucas, the allegations concerning the data fraud alone are catastrophic. The RICO suit is an existential threat. The board's fiduciary duty is clear. Effective immediately, you are placed on administrative leave. Pending the outcome of an internal investigation, all operational authority is transferred to the COO." Thorne was speechless. They were throwing him overboard to save the ship. "You can't do this," he whispered. "I am this company." Elena's voice was ice. "Not anymore. Goodbye, Lucas." The call disconnected. He sat in the darkening office, the city lights twinkling on as if nothing had happened. He had lost his company. His reputation was ashes. But the most corrosive thought, the one that ate at him, was the memory of Maria's face in the boardroom. Not triumphant, not gloating, just calm. She had known this would happen. Every step of his collapse had been a move she anticipated. His phone buzzed. It was Cale. "The visa revocation is filed, but I have additional information. The boy's treatment at the Basel Institute is not just for muscular dystrophy. The protocol is experimental, targeting a specific genetic marker. The same marker is referenced in the altered medical data from the Brazilian hospital records. The data Apex used was fabricated to hide a known side effect of a different drug, a side effect that manifests as muscular dystrophy." Thorne's blood ran cold. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the data your company bought and used to build its core product wasn't just fake. It was designed to cover up pharmaceutical fraud. And the woman you turned into a cleaner, her son's condition, it may not be genetic bad luck. It may be iatrogenic, doctor-caused, by the very data set you told her to ignore." The room spun. The arrogance of that moment years ago, "The data is validated, stay in your lane," echoed with a new, monstrous consequence. He hadn't just silenced a whistleblower. He had possibly condemned her child to a lifetime of suffering, all to protect a profitable lie. The moral ground beneath him vanished entirely. He wasn't just a ruthless businessman anymore. He was something far worse. Cale's voice was grim. "This changes the calculus, Mr. Thorne. The Foundation's lawyers don't have this medical link yet. But if they subpoena the original Brazilian data providers and connect the dots, this goes from corporate fraud to something with a prison sentence measured in decades. You need to settle. You need to settle now before they find this." But it was too late. As Thorne grappled with this new abyss, a different phone rang, his secure, encrypted line. It was Diane Croft, his lawyer. She sounded shell-shocked. "Lucas, the Department of Justice just called. They're not waiting for the civil suit. They've convened a grand jury. They're seeking indictments for wire fraud, conspiracy, and violations of the Controlled Substances Act related to medical data. They want you to come in for questioning, voluntarily, tomorrow." "What do I do?" Thorne asked, the arrogance finally gone, replaced by raw fear. "You remain silent. You plead the fifth. But Lucas, they have a cooperating witness, someone inside Apex who's been giving them everything for months." Who? Thorne demanded, mind racing through his inner circle. Diane took a sharp breath. They didn't name them, but the witness codename is Janitor. The janitor's testimony was the final nail. For 3 hours, Maria Silva sat before the federal grand jury, not as a cleaner, but as Dr. Costa, the architect and the whistleblower. She walked them through the altered data, the fabricated medical records, and the email chain that proved Lucas Thorne knew. She presented her own son's medical file, drawing the line from the fraudulent data to his diagnosis. The indictment came down 72 hours later. Lucas Thorne was charged with 13 counts of wire fraud, conspiracy, and criminal violations of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The SEC filed parallel civil charges. Apex Dynamics board, desperate to save the company, immediately settled the RICO suit with the Solara Foundation, agreeing to a 9-figure penalty and a total dismantling of Project Da Vinci. Thorne was cut loose, his assets frozen, his golden parachute shredded by the clawback provisions in his own employment contract. The public collapse was swift and brutal. News outlets ran side-by-side photos, the arrogant CEO at his peak and the mugshot from his surrender. The narrative was irresistible, the billionaire who mocked his cleaner only to be destroyed by her. But for Maria, the public victory was secondary. Leo began his treatment. The first rounds were grueling, but the doctors were hopeful. The money was a shield, finally allowing her to fight for her son's future instead of just surviving the day. Thorne's legal strategy crumbled. His lawyers advised a plea deal. The evidence was overwhelming, and Maria's testimony was unimpeachable. He pleaded guilty to 3 counts of conspiracy and wire fraud, accepting a plea agreement that promised a reduced sentence in exchange for his full cooperation against the Brazilian data vendors and the pharmaceutical middlemen who had orchestrated the original fraud. At his sentencing hearing, the judge listened to statements. The prosecution detailed the scale of the deception. Thorne's own statement was a flat, rehearsed apology. Then Maria stood. She didn't address the court. She looked directly at Lucas Thorne. "You saw people as functions," she said, her voice clear in the silent room. "Assets or liabilities. You saw my work as an asset to be stolen. You saw my concerns as a liability to be erased. You saw me, the person holding the mop, as nothing, a null value. But there is no such thing. Everyone has a story. Everyone has a value you cannot quantify. You built an empire on the belief that data could predict humanity, but you failed to understand humanity at all. That is why you lost." The judge sentenced him to 8 years in federal prison, plus restitution payments totaling millions. As the marshals led him away, the look on his face wasn't anger. It was a hollow confusion, as if he was still trying to process the equation that had led him here. For Maria, a different life began. With the settlement secured and Leo in stable care, she accepted a role at the Solara Foundation, leading their new ethics in artificial intelligence division. She used a portion of the funds to establish a legal defense network for whistleblowers in the tech industry, named the Costa Shield. She never had to clean another office. But the story had one final, quiet twist. A year after Thorne entered prison, a package arrived at Maria's foundation office. It contained no return address, only a handwritten note on plain paper and a small, worn notebook. The note read, "From the discovery file of K, you should have this." The notebook was her own, from her early days in the Sao Paulo lab. It contained the original, raw ideas for what would become Project Da Vinci, ideas about mapping neural pathways to help diagnose neurological diseases, not sell products. It was the vision she'd had before Apex corrupted it. Tucked in the back was a single sheet of paper, a photocopy of a bank transfer receipt. It showed a payment from an anonymous offshore account to a clinic in Sao Paulo, dated 5 years earlier. The memo line read, "Treatment for El Silva." The amount was exactly what her first, shoddy health insurance had refused to cover for Leo's initial tests. The payment had kept him stable long enough to get to America. Maria never discovered who Kay was or why he sent it. Perhaps it was a flicker of conscience from a man who sold his skills to the highest bidder. Perhaps it was a final message that even in the darkest systems, small acts of humanity could exist. She kept the notebook. She framed the first page, which held her original, hopeful thesis question, "Can we use the map of the mind to heal?" She hung it in her new office, a reminder of where it all began and what she had almost lost. Leo, growing stronger, would sometimes ask about the man in the picture on the news, the one who went to jail. Maria would simply say he was someone who forgot that people matter more than power. And that, in the end, was the whole story. A story that began with a dismissal and ended with a reckoning, proving that dignity is never a null value, and that sometimes the quietest person in the room holds the loudest truth. The collapse of Lucas Thorne's empire became a case study taught in business ethics seminars and law schools. But the real lesson wasn't about legal liability or stock crashes. It was about a fundamental blindness, the dangerous assumption that a person's value is determined by their position in a hierarchy. For 3 years, Maria Silva was invisible to the man who occupied the penthouse. He saw a uniform, a function, a cost on a spreadsheet. He never saw the genius, the resilience, or the fierce love that powered her. He miscalculated the most important variable of all, human dignity, and in that miscalculation, he engineered his own ruin. This story taps into a deep, almost universal fantasy. The moment the overlooked and the underestimated reveal their true power, and justice is served not from above, but from below. It satisfies a craving for moral balance in a world where too often the arrogant seem to win. Research tells us that narratives of status reversal and deserved comeuppance are intensely compelling because they repair a perceived imbalance in the social order. They whisper that the world can be fair. But beyond the fantasy, Maria and Thorne's story reflects a painful reality. Studies show workplace bullying affects approximately 11% of workers, with unskilled and blue-collar workers being frequent targets. A staggering gap exists between executive power and employee vulnerability. Many people have felt like Maria at some point, silenced, diminished, made to feel like a null value in someone else's grand equation. The irony is that Thorne's entire business was built on predicting human behavior, yet he failed to comprehend the most basic driver of it, the need to be seen, to be respected, to matter. He treated empathy as a weakness and humiliation as a tool. In the end, those were the very forces that unraveled him. Maria's victory wasn't just a financial or legal one. It was a reclamation of narrative. She rewrote the story from being a victim to being the author. She took the very algorithm meant to manipulate desires and used it to secure her son's future, transforming a tool of control into an instrument of care. The notebook on her wall, with its original question about healing, is a testament to that reclamation. So what do we take from this? Perhaps it's a reminder to look closer. The person serving your coffee, driving your bus, cleaning your office, they are not just performing a function. They are whole human beings with vast, unseen histories, capabilities, and battles. Underestimating them is not just a moral failure, it's a strategic blindness. True strength isn't found in the ability to dominate, but in the capacity to recognize the inherent worth in others, especially those the system tells you to ignore. Compassion isn't a line item on a budget. It's the bedrock of sustainable success in business and in life. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been profoundly underestimated only to have a moment where the truth turned the tables? Or have you ever realized too late that you misjudged someone based on their role or appearance? Share your story in the comments below. These conversations are how we learn. If this story of quiet strength and dramatic justice resonated with you, make sure to subscribe. We explore the hidden layers of power, consequence, and the human stories that redefine what it means to win. Remember, everyone has a story. Don't judge the book by the cover you're shown. Sometimes the most powerful chapters are written by the quietest hands.